Philadelphia is the birthplace of American independence, a city of historic streets and neighborhoods built over centuries. But in Kensington, another story has become impossible to ignore. People living outside addiction in public view, and blocks struggling under the weight of a street crisis that has lasted for years. These lives did not all arrive here the same way. For some, the first break was housing. For others, addiction, family loss, illness, or instability came first. Once life moves onto the street, those problems can begin feeding each other. And now Philadelphia has a contradiction. The city's 2026 count says unsheltered homelessness fell 39%. Yet, Kensington remains at the center of Philadelphia's response to addiction, homelessness, and street disorder. So what changed? Are people actually getting off the streets, or has the crisis simply become harder to see? That is the Philadelphia story we are following. Philadelphia can feel like two cities occupying the same map. One is the city visitors recognize historic blocks, crowded restaurants, universities, hospitals, row houses, and neighborhoods that carry generations of memory. The other is easier to miss until you reach streets where the crisis becomes impossible to ignore. In Kensington, people can be seen carrying everything they own, resting near transit stops, moving between outreach workers and treatment services, or trying to make it through another day while addiction, unstable housing, and poverty overlap in public. But the official numbers now tell a surprising story. Philadelphia's 2026 point-in-time count found 5,163 people experiencing homelessness across the city, nearly 7% fewer than the year before. Of that total, 711 people were counted living unsheltered. That was down from 1,178 in 2025, a 39% decline. On paper, that is real progress. But a count taken on one night cannot explain what one block feels like the next morning. It cannot show the person who slept indoors last night, but may be outside again next week. It cannot show someone moving between treatment shelter, a relative's couch, and the street. And they cannot explain why a neighborhood can still look overwhelmed even while the citywide number moves downward. That is the contradiction at the center of Philadelphia's story. The city is not doing nothing. Outreach teams continue working in Kensington, connecting people to shelter, behavioral health care, medical treatment, and other services. In 2026, Philadelphia also expanded a centralized wellness response in the neighborhood, bringing treatment, housing assessments, behavioral health support, and other services into the same system. Yet, visible suffering has not disappeared. That matters because homelessness is not measured only by tents. It can be a person sleeping on a train, staying temporarily with friends moving through shelters, or spending nights in places never meant to become a home. So when Philadelphia reports fewer people outside, the right question is not whether the number is true. The harder question is what changed and whether the change is strong enough to last. Because before we can understand why Kensington still carries so much of the city's street crisis, we have to understand how people arrive there in the first place. The road to a sidewalk in Philadelphia usually begins long before anyone sees a tent. For many people, the first stage still looks almost normal. A worker loses hours, rent is late, a medical bill arrives, someone falls behind on a car payment, or asks family for help. The apartment is still there, so the crisis remains invisible. Then, the temporary fixes begin. A friend offers a couch. A relative gives someone a few weeks. A motel becomes an emergency option. A car becomes a place to sleep while the person keeps working and tries to recover. For a while, that can hold everything together. But temporary housing has an expiration date. A family member needs the room back. Motel money runs out. The car needs repairs. A job becomes harder to keep. One setback begins creating the next. That is when a housing problem can turn into a street problem. And not every person reaches that point for the same reason. For some, the pressure is financial. For others, illness, domestic conflict, mental health problems, or addiction make an unstable situation harder to survive. Sometimes substance use is part of the story before housing is lost. Sometimes it becomes more serious after someone is already outside. What matters is how quickly the layers begin stacking. Without a stable address, replacing identification becomes harder. Without a working phone, appointments are easier to miss. Without transportation, keeping a job or reaching services takes more time. Without sleep, every decision becomes more difficult. By the time someone arrives in Kensington, the visible crisis may be the final stage of a much longer collapse. That is why the neighborhood can be misunderstood. People see addiction in public people sleeping outside and people moving through the same blocks every day, and it can look as if the street itself created the problem. But the street is often where several problems finally become visible at once. Housing instability, income loss, family breakdown, health problems, addiction, then survival. And once those pressures are concentrated in one place, leaving becomes harder too. A person is no longer trying to solve one problem. They are trying to solve several at the same time. That is where Kensington becomes more than a homelessness story. It becomes a story about what happens when addiction and street survival begin feeding each other. Kensington has become one of the most recognizable symbols of Philadelphia's drug crisis. But what people see on the sidewalk is only the surface. In 2024, Philadelphia recorded 1,069 unintentional overdose deaths. That was an 18% decline from the year before and 24% below the city's 2022 peak. Even so, opioids were still involved in 77% of overdose deaths and stimulants in 70%. Half of all fatal overdoses involve both opioids and stimulants. That matters because the street drug supply has become more complicated than one drug or one addiction. Fentanyl remained the opioid most often detected in fatal overdoses. Cocaine was the most common stimulant. Xylazine was found in more than one-third of all overdose deaths, while medetomidine, another veterinary sedative, had also entered Philadelphia's drug supply. For someone already living outside that changing supply, adds another layer of risk. A person may use to avoid withdrawal. Another may be trying to stay awake because sleeping outside feels unsafe. Someone else may be using to numb trauma pain or the stress of losing housing and family connections. Then street survival begins feeding the addiction. Money goes toward avoiding withdrawal. Appointments are missed. Wounds become harder to manage. A phone disappears. A place in treatment opens, but the person is no longer where an outreach team expected to find them. And the cycle keeps moving. This does not mean everyone experiencing homelessness in Kensington uses drugs. It does not mean addiction explains every tent doorway or person sleeping outside. But in a neighborhood where public drug use, unstable housing, and behavioral health crises overlap, addiction can become the most visible part of a much larger story. Philadelphia's current Kensington response specifically combines substance use treatment, behavioral health services, outreach housing, assessment, and diversion programs, because those problems frequently intersect. There is also evidence that some interventions are reducing harm. Philadelphia's overdose deaths have been moving downward, and the city continues distributing naloxone, drug testing supplies, and treatment connections. But fewer deaths do not automatically mean fewer people trapped in addiction. A person can survive an overdose and still have nowhere safe to sleep that night. They can enter treatment and still return to the same block afterward. And that is why Kensington cannot be understood as only a drug problem. It is also a housing problem, a health problem, and a daily survival problem, happening in the same few streets. A day on the street in Kensington is built around problems that repeat before the last one is solved. Morning may begin on a sidewalk, in a doorway, near a transit stop, or somewhere chosen because it felt safer than the alternatives. A bag may be missing, medication may be gone, a phone may be dead. A person may wake up with a wound that looks worse than it did the day before. That matters because health problems can become part of street survival quickly. An untreated cut can turn into an infection. Swelling makes walking harder. Someone trying to reach treatment may first need food, water, clean clothes, or help managing a wound before they can think about anything else. Then there is hygiene. Finding a bathroom can take time. A shower can depend on a shelter service center or outreach program. Clean clothes can matter for a medical visit, a benefits appointment, a job interview, or simply for entering a building without being pushed away. The phone is another fragile connection. It may contain a caseworker's number, directions to treatment, an appointment reminder, or the only way family can still reach someone. Lose the phone and the system becomes harder to access. Transportation adds another layer. A clinic, shelter, treatment program, meal site, and housing appointment may all be in different places. Someone can spend hours moving across Philadelphia while carrying everything they still own. And all of that happens while addiction, withdrawal, exhaustion, and fear may still be present. By afternoon, survival can narrow into a short list. Find food. Find water. Protect the bag. Keep the phone alive. Make the appointment. Find somewhere to rest. Then, night arrives, and the same question returns. Where can I sleep without being moved, robbed, assaulted, or pulled deeper into the same environment I am trying to escape? From the outside, this can look like someone is making no progress. From inside it, the day may already be full. That is why treatment alone does not automatically end homelessness. A person can be willing to change and still spend most of the day solving problems created by having nowhere stable to live. And that leads to the next question. If treatment is available, why can someone complete it and still end up back on the same street? Treatment can interrupt addiction. It cannot by itself rebuild everything that may have collapsed around it. A person may enter detox, begin medication, receive medical care, and spend days or weeks away from the street. Sleep may become regular. Meals arrive on schedule. Wounds are treated. Withdrawal is managed. The next step can finally seem possible. Then treatment ends. And the question becomes, where does the person go next? If the answer is a stable recovery, setting the progress has room to continue. If the answer is the same sidewalk, the same people, the same drug supply, and the same uncertainty about food and sleep recovery, becomes harder to protect. Philadelphia's current response is built around that gap. The city's wellness ecosystem combines substance use treatment with housing, medical care, economic opportunity, and social support. Riverview Wellness Village was created specifically as recovery housing for people who have experienced homelessness and completed inpatient substance use treatment. The city says its goal is for residents to spend about a year there and eventually leave with permanent housing income and better health outcomes. That matters because recovery takes time. A treatment program may stabilize someone physically, but rebuilding a life can require identification benefits, employment routines, mental health care, family connections, and a place where the next night is not in question. At Riverview, Philadelphia reported that by January 2026, more than 60% of residents had remained stabilized on site for at least 90 days. Most had experienced street homelessness, and every resident had access to substance use treatment, mental health services, and primary medical care on campus. Those numbers do not prove that every person will remain in recovery. They show why the city is trying to connect treatment to something longer than treatment itself. The same logic now appears in Kensington. The Kensington Wellness Support Center brings medical care, substance use services, behavioral health support, legal help, and housing assessments into one location. In 2025, the city says roughly 5,000 people were engaged there, with about half connected directly to services. But a connection is still only the beginning. Someone still has to remain engaged long enough to move from crisis to treatment to recovery and eventually to housing. And that is why the next question matters. If Philadelphia has shelters, outreach, treatment, and new recovery programs, why are people still ending up back outside? The question sounds simple. If Philadelphia has shelters, why are people still sleeping outside? The first answer is that shelter does exist, and the city has been expanding it. Philadelphia's Office of Homeless Services says anyone who needs shelter can go to a city-funded intake center, and street outreach teams can help people get there. The city has also been converting winter-only beds to year-round use and moving toward roughly 1,000 additional shelter beds across the system. So the problem is not that there is no door to walk through. The harder part is what happens before and after that door. At intake, a person has to complete an assessment. For longer-term assistance, documents such as identification, social security records, and recent proof of income may be needed. The city notes that a household cannot be denied shelter simply because proof of ID is missing. But paperwork still matters for benefits, housing applications, and the next steps after emergency shelter. Then there's the human side. Someone living outside may be dealing with withdrawal, untreated mental illness, a medical problem, fear, exhaustion, or years of distrust. One conversation with an outreach worker may not be enough. A person may say no today and yes later. They may enter shelter, leave, return to the street, and need to be contacted again. That is why Philadelphia continues street outreach and service connection work rather than treating shelter as a one-step solution. And even when someone accepts a bed, the original crisis is not over. A shelter can provide safety, sleep, food, case management, and a place to begin rebuilding. But it is still temporary. The real exit comes when someone can move from emergency shelter into treatment, recovery housing, supportive housing, or a permanent apartment. That is the bottleneck viewers often do not see. Philadelphia can add beds and bring more people indoors, and the 2026 count suggests that this effort may be helping. Unsheltered homelessness fell sharply. But bringing someone inside for one night is different from keeping them housed for the next year. The real measure is whether the shelter system becomes a doorway forward, not another place to wait. And that is where Philadelphia's response has been changing most aggressively. Philadelphia's response has changed because the city is no longer treating the crisis as one problem with one solution. The new approach is built around movement. Find someone outside, bring them indoors, stabilize the immediate crisis, connect them to treatment, healthcare benefits, and housing, then keep the next step from breaking down. One visible change is shelter capacity. In March 2026, Philadelphia opened Hope 220, a new Office of Homeless Services Solution Center, with more than 70 beds on site, primary health care, behavioral health case management, and direct access to permanent housing placement options. The city also converted beds at more than a dozen shelters from winter-only use to year-round availability, part of a plan that officials say will soon add about 1,000 beds across the shelter system. But Philadelphia also changed what happens before someone reaches a shelter. The city launched the One Philly Ambassadors of Hope street outreach team with Project Home in Center City and Old City, while expanding hours and meals at the Hub of Hope. The goal is simple: make contact earlier, keep contact longer, and create a clearer route indoors. Kensington is where that strategy becomes more aggressive. In June 2026, the city formally opened the Kensington Wellness Support Center, bringing medical care, behavioral health services, substance use treatment access, housing assessments, and other support into one location. Connected to it is Philadelphia's first dedicated neighborhood wellness courtroom. For eligible people arrested for minor offenses connected to public drug use, the model is designed to move them quickly through medical and behavioral health assessment, legal review, and possible diversion into treatment, instead of simply returning them to the street. That is a major shift in philosophy. The old question was often, how do we move this person off this block The newer question is, where do they go next? A shelter bed without a path forward can become temporary storage for a crisis. Treatment without housing can send someone back into the same environment. Enforcement without services can move visible disorder without resolving the reasons it returns. Philadelphia is trying to connect those pieces, and the first citywide numbers suggest something may be changing. But the most surprising number is still ahead. Because in 2026, the count of people sleeping outside did not merely fall, it fell sharply. The number is hard to ignore. In Philadelphia's 2026 point-in-time count, 711 people were found living unsheltered across the city. 1 year earlier, the number was 1,178. That is a 39% drop. Overall homelessness also fell from 5,516 people in 2025 to 5,163 in 2026, a decline of nearly 7%. For a city that had seen unsheltered homelessness rising since 2023, that reversal matters. And it suggests that some of the changes Philadelphia made may be having an effect. More year-round shelter capacity, more street outreach, new solution centers, more coordinated connections to behavioral health care treatment and housing. But this is where the story needs caution. A point-in-time count is exactly what the name suggests, a snapshot of one night. It tells us how many people, volunteers, and service providers identified as sheltered or unsheltered on February 25, 2026. It does not follow every person over the year. It does not count someone temporarily staying on a friend's couch. And it cannot tell us whether every person who moved indoors will still be housed months later. There is another detail worth noticing. While the unsheltered count fell sharply, the number of people staying in shelters, transitional housing, or safe haven programs increased slightly, from 4,338 to 4,452. That does not prove that everyone missing from the street count simply moved into shelter, but it does show why the headline alone cannot tell the whole story. The strongest conclusion is narrower. On the night Philadelphia counted homelessness in 2026, far fewer people were found sleeping outside than the year before. That is progress. The question is whether Philadelphia can make it durable. Can emergency shelter become permanent housing? Can someone leaving treatment avoid returning to the same block? Can outreach reach people before another crisis pushes them deeper into street life? And can Kensington change without simply pushing visible suffering somewhere else? Those are harder tests than one annual count. Because success is not only a cleaner sidewalk or a lower number. It is whether the person who was outside last year is still indoors next year. Philadelphia has produced an encouraging signal. Now it has to prove that the signal represents a lasting exit from homelessness, not just a better night. Philadelphia will still look familiar tomorrow. The trains will run, shops will open, people will go to work and lock a door behind them at night. For others, that part is uncertain. After all the numbers, treatment programs, shelters, and outreach teams, the story comes back to something simpler. A safe place to sleep, a working phone, a place to keep medication, a door that closes. Philadelphia's 2026 count suggests progress. Fewer people were found sleeping outside. But the harder test comes after the count is over. Can someone leaving treatment stay housed? Can a shelter bed become a permanent home? Can a person in Kensington rebuild enough stability that they do not return to the same block months later? That is what lasting progress would look like. Not simply fewer tents, not simply fewer people visible on one night, but fewer people forced to begin the same survival routine again. What should Philadelphia focus on? First, permanent housing addiction treatment shelter capacity, or long-term recovery support? Tell us in the comments. And for more stories about America's street crisis, subscribe to Homeless Crisis News.